Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you all for coming today. Today's conference is titled Crises of Democracies and Violations of Human Rights in Egypt, organised and put together by the Egyptians for Democracy in the UK. So thank you once again for coming from all parts of London and elsewhere. Before we start today, we'll start with a Quran recitation as we do with all our events. So I'll pass on to Brother Abdullah, who will give us a few moments of Quran recitation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم طاسيم ميم تلك آيات الكتاب المبين نتلو عليك من نبأ موسى وفرعون بالحق لقوم يؤمنون إن فرعون علا في الأرض وجعل أهلها شيعا يستضعف طائفة منهم يذبح أبناءهم ويستحيي نساءهم إنه كان من المفسدين ونريد أن نمن على الذين استضعفوا في الأرض ونجعلهم أئمة ونجعلهم الوارثين ونمكن لهم في الأرض ونري فرعون وهامان وجنودهما منهم ما كانوا يحذرون وأوحينا إلى أم موسى أن أرضعيه فإذا خفت عليه فألقيه في اليم ولا تخافي ولا تحزني إنا رادوه إليك وجاعلوه من المرسلين فالتقطه آل فرعون ليكون لهم عدوا وحزنا إن فرعون وهامان وجنودهما كانوا خاطئين وقالت امرأة فرعون قرة عين لي ولك لا تقتلوه عسى أن ينفعنا أو نتخذه ولدا وهم لا يشعرون وأصبح فؤاد أم موسى فارغا إن كادت لتبدي به لولا أن ربطنا على قلبها لتكون من المؤمنين وقالت لأخته قصيه فبصرت به عن جنب وهم لا يشعرون وحرمنا عليه المراضع من قبل فقالت هل أدلكم على أهل بيت يكفلونه لكم وهم له ناصحون فرددناه إلى أمه كي تقر عينها ولا تحزن ولتعلم أن وعد الله حق ولكن أكثرهم لا يعلمون صدق
الله. Jazakumullah khairan. So my name's Yasmin Adam and I'll be your chair for today, inshallah. Just to go over a few housekeeping rules, there are no planned fire alarms. So in the case of a fire alarm, the exit is just on my right, your left, so just this one here. Similarly, male and female bathrooms are just as soon as you walk out here, so feel free to get up whenever you need so. We're going to begin by playing a BBC report, which will give some context to the situation in Egypt for those who don't know, and for those who do, as many I'm sure are aware, just a recap. And then we'll introduce our guests.
Welcome to Egypt. Enticing images of timeless hospitality and ancient attractions. A picture postcard view the authorities are keen to promote. But there is another Egypt, a military-backed regime, where dreams of freedom have been crushed.
It's understandable to be scared with a regime that is not hesitant about killing. I've never seen a regime as bloody as Sisi's regime.
It all looked so different 7 years ago. This was Tahrir Square in February 2011. The night the people broke free of President Hosni Mubarak, ending 30 years of authoritarian rule. Or so they hoped. But now the square feels like a place of lost opportunity. Well, standing here in Tahrir Square 7 years on, there's really nothing to indicate that this was the cradle of an uprising, that it was here that the people toppled an autocrat. The monument is bare, no list of names of all of those who were killed, and that's just the way the authorities want it. It's as if the revolution has been erased, and along with it, the hope it brought. Icons of the uprising, like Daud Abdullah, have been treated as enemies of the state. He was a leading light of the Tahrir protests, secular, articulate, a software developer. Abdel Fattah was accused of organising this protest. The demonstrators appeared peaceful. The authorities were not. Others told the authorities they organised the protest, but he was still sentenced to 5 years. Another member of Egypt's generation jail. His fractured family go through the motions, without a much-loved son, husband and brother. Human rights groups say there are thousands like them in Egypt, families of political prisoners. His sister Mona campaigns against civilians being tried in military courts. In this household, resistance runs in the family. But Mona says the struggle for change is harder than ever under President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi.
The level of bloodiness is beyond anything I've ever heard or experienced. And the way they have managed to desensitize people towards death, to belittle the value of people's life, to make people get used to death sentences, to forced disappearances and abduction, to torture victims. This is becoming daily news.
Her brother has another year to serve, then faces a further 5 years on probation with stringent conditions. In this tightly knit group, the empty space at the table is keenly felt. Those who end up in custody can expect the harshest treatment. My sources say torture is commonplace, but few victims are willing to speak. Mahmoud Mohammed Hussein has first-hand experience of the latest torture techniques. He was accused of attending a banned protest and held without trial for more than 2 years. He says the only reason he was arrested, aged just 18, was because of his T-shirt. The slogan read, "A nation without torture."
واتكهربت في مناطق حساسة في جسمي، يعني كان في كهرباء منها هنا وفي الجزء اللي تحت اتكهربت برضو فيه. يعني كنت معرفش، يعني ما كنتش عارف إحساسي أو شعوري إيه ساعتها، بس كنت حزين وبتألم جدا، وكان في ضرب بشكل متعمد يكون في المنطقة اللي أنا قلت له إن أنا رجلي فيها تعبانة، لدرجة إن هو خلاني لحد من دلوقتي من شهور قليلة جدا كنت بستعمل عكاز وعملت أكتر من عملية.
Aren't you afraid that by speaking out like this that the authorities could come after you again?
هو أنا طبعا مدرك ده كويس جدا، وعارف إن يعني هو أنا مش موجود عشان أقول مجرد كلام وخلاص. أنا بقول الكلام علشان يعني هحب إن هو يكون بيتشاف، لعل وعسى يعني يتخذ بيه ويكون يعني تحاول تنهي حاجة أو على الأقل تخليهم يكونوا أشد حرصا في إن هم ما يعملوش حاجة. يعني أتمنى إن يكون كلامي بيتسمع ويتخذ بيه يعني.
Torture victims used to have one refuge, the Al Nadim Center in Cairo. But last year the authorities moved in and forced it to close its doors. Its co-founder, a psychiatrist, says the prevalence of torture in the Sisi era is the worst she's ever known.
You know, I work in this field since 1993. And I've been hearing about this field since my university years. What I've been seeing and what my colleagues at the center have been seeing since 2013 is unheard of. It was never, ever that bad.
So how widespread would you say the practice is now?
As widespread as the country. As widespread as the country.
What would you say to government officials here in Egypt who deny there is torture?
You're liars. I would say you're liars. I would say you know there is torture because you practice it.
And then there are those who are hidden behind the sun. That's what Egyptians call the growing numbers who vanish from the streets and are held in secret by the state. Anyone opposing the regime is at risk. Human rights campaigners say enforced disappearances are a trademark of the Sisi era. They have documented at least 1,500 cases in the past 4 years. But they believe the real figure is much higher. This is Zubaida, a student of 23, who wants to open her own business. Her mother says she and Zubaida were arrested near a demonstration in 2014 and convicted of offences including attending a banned protest. She says they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and spent 7 months in jail, but were later acquitted. She tells me that in 2016, Zubaida was detained again at a police checkpoint and disappeared. She was dumped by the roadside after 28 days, a changed girl.
فلقيت جسمها مقطع ومتكهربة يعني معذبينها وصدمتني لما قالت لي إن يعني اعتدوا عليها ويعني عملوا فيها كل اللي يغضب ربنا عملوا فيها كل شيء يعني مش كويس عملوا فيها فطبعا أنا صدمت طبعا.
But her legal papers show the anguish did not end there. As Zubaida was struggling to recover, she disappeared for the second time last April. Her mother says neighbours saw her being taken by armed and masked police.
ندور على زبيدة لي 10 شهور كل يوم نموت 100 مرة يعني أسرة كاملة اتدمرت أسرة كاملة من 6 أنفار أنا وأخواتها اتدمرنا بمعنى كلمة اتدمرنا إحنا لدرجة إن إحنا نتمنى الموت عشان ما اللحظة اللي إحنا فيها لحظة صعب جدا ودي
Zubaida's treasured keepsakes are just as she left them,
حضرتك دي زحلفة جايباها من
waiting for her return.
نظفها دايما.
Her mother refuses to give up hope, refuses to be silenced.
يا ريت ياخذوني أنا ويسيبوها هي يا ريت ياخذوني أنا اعتقلوني مع إن إحنا ما عملناش حاجة يعني إحنا ما عملناش حاجة للسلطة يعني إزاي بنتي مختفية واخدينها ويعذبوها وأنا ما نتكلمش إزاي أي قانون يقول الكلام ده ولا أي دين أو أي عرق يقول إن أنا بنتي مختفية واخدينها وأنا ما نتكلمش لا نتكلم لو كلامي هي يعود علي أننا نتعلق على حبل المشانق هنتكلم.
We wanted to ask the authorities about Zubaida's disappearance and the other cases in this report, but they wouldn't give us an interview. Previously, the authorities have told me there is no systematic torture. But if mistakes are made, officers are punished. They've also denied there are enforced disappearances and widespread human rights abuses. On the banks of the Nile, there's little hint of change. Egypt looks locked in the past. Elections are coming, but President Sisi doesn't need to worry about the outcome. Several potential challengers have been intimidated out of the race. Many here are concerned about security amid bomb attacks by the so-called Islamic State. The president says he's waging war on terror, but human rights campaigners say he's using that as a pretext to wage war on dissent. Having been here for more than 4 years, I know a lot of the problems that Egypt is facing. There are real economic issues. There are serious security threats from IS. But this is the most populous country in the Arab world, and if Egypt can't steer a course towards real democracy, that's a problem for the Middle East, and it's a problem for the West. And I'm leaving here with questions. How long before all of the repression here starts to backfire? And how many more prisons can the regime fill?
So this first session will last until 4 p.m. The structure of the session will be that each speaker will be given the opportunity to speak, and then there'll be a chance for a Q&A session with the audience afterwards. So to introduce our speakers, on my right I have Mona Bayoumi, a barrister from Cardiff who specialises in human rights. On my left I have Amelia Smith, a journalist who lived in Egypt and specialises there and works for the Middle East Monitor. And on my far left I have Dr. Daud Abdullah, the director of Middle East Monitor. So I'll start off with Dr. Daud Abdullah.
Thank you. I think it has become crystal clear to all observers of the Egyptian scene that the coup of 2013 was not a coup against the Muslim Brotherhood, but a coup against Egyptian democracy. This is absolutely clear right now. And it was a coup planned internally and executed internally, but fundamentally it was supported by regimes across the region that saw democracy as a threat. And foremost among these, of course, is Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. For them, any democratic development in the region pose a threat to their autocratic systems. And the Sisi regime, which seized power in 2013, because of its lack of legitimacy, took the lifeline that was given to it by the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis, and the Israelis. But of course, there was a price to be paid. The Israelis, the Saudis, and the Emiratis were not going to support the regime without getting something in return. And for the Saudis, the immediate threat that they faced was the emerging democratic system or movement towards democratic rule in Yemen. They didn't want that to come across the border in the south into their own territories. So Sisi had to play a role along with them to reverse the democratic changes that were taking place in Yemen. And similarly, for the Emiratis, he had to play a role in forestalling any growth of democracy in Libya. Not to mention, of course, Palestine. But what started as political maneuverings to obstruct democracy in Yemen and in Libya soon evolved into military activities. So now the Sisi regime is involved militarily in Yemen as well as in Libya. And of course, in the case of Gaza, it has destroyed its military. Take pride in the fact that they have destroyed hundreds of tunnels in Gaza, which used to be a lifeline for the besieged people in Gaza. All of this, of course, was done in the name of war on terror. I want to say a few words about the Sinai, because here there was a political problem, no doubt, for many years, that could have been addressed through a dialogue and through trying to meet the needs of the people of the Sinai, their economic needs, their social needs. Instead, the regime opted for a military solution to the crisis in the Sinai. And they have made matters worse by so doing, opening the doors for Israel's involvement in the Sinai Peninsula, and for others, such as ISIS. Because we know before 2013, ISIS had no presence in the Sinai. Today, the Sinai is referred to as Wilayat Sina, yani the province of Sinai for the ISIS group. They had no presence there prior to 2013. But the way the regime went about addressing with the socioeconomic problems in the region exacerbated the situation and allowed these elements from outside of Egypt also to play a role in that part of the country. Now, Egypt's failure, the regime's failure to deal with the Sinai has allowed the Israelis to claim that it faces a threat from the Sinai Peninsula, that the Sisi regime can no longer guarantee its own security. So they told the Americans that we want to become involved in the Sinai also. And so the irony of all of this is that when they toppled Morsi in 2013, they claimed that he was a threat to the Camp David Agreement, that the Camp David Agreement had restored the Sinai to Egypt from Israel. What we have today is that Israel is back in the Sinai. Israel is a part and parcel of what is happening there. Last month, the New York Times published an article by David Kirkpatrick. That article was titled "Secret Alliance. Israel carries out airstrikes on Egypt with Cairo's okay." At the moment, the Israelis are carrying out military operations, airstrikes in Egypt with the approval, with the connivance, in total cooperation with the Egyptian regime. For the last 2 years, the report stated that there were over 100 airstrikes carried out by Israel inside of Egypt. Sometimes, in most cases, the aircrafts which they use, whether they are drones or fighter jets, they are unmarked. And instead of coming from Israel directly, they go around inside of Egypt and then come up to the Sinai to give the impression that this is not Israel aircrafts operating, but these are Egyptian aircrafts. The truth of the matter is, they are the ones involved. And so Kirkpatrick, he concluded his article by saying that this is the most remarkable reconfiguration, political reconfiguration in the region since 2011. He is right in that sense, because, as I said, Israel is now back in control of the Sinai. That's the reality. And the Sisi regime cannot do anything there without their approval. So I want to continue on this theme, just to raise some questions about the Sinai and what is referred to as the deal of the century. Because the Israelis are claiming that when Trump comes to the region in May to open the embassy in Jerusalem on the 15th of May of the century from Cairo, and a fundamental tenet of the deal of the century is what happens to the Sinai, that the Sinai would absorb the Palestinian refugees and will somehow merge with Gaza and Rafah in particular. Now, if we notice, there's a lot of diplomatic activity taking place in the region right now. And there seems to be some measure of credence to what the Israelis are saying about the Sinai. Because right now they are pressuring, he sent envoys to Jordan to pressure the Jordanians to accept the deal of the century, to accept that they have to make concessions in the Sinai in order to undermine the Palestinian aspiration for a self-determination inside of Palestine on Palestinian territory. But that Egypt would have to make concessions in the Sinai for this so-called deal of the century to be realized. Now, some questions I want to raise before I close is that if a government, if a regime cannot resolve its own internal problems, as is the case with the Sinai, is it qualified to resolve problems in southern Sudan, for example? They claim that they want to become involved in the southern Sudan to resolve the civil war in Sudan. Or are they qualified to resolve the conflict in Libya when they can't even resolve what is happening inside? You see, or in Yemen for that matter. It is clear that they're not qualified. And they have lost their way in the region. Neither can they play a role in the Syrian conflict. Because of their closeness to the Saudis and the Emiratis, they are not trusted by the Iranians or the Iraqis and the Syrians themselves. So this is a regime that has become very much isolated from all the centers of power in the region and all the major conflicts in the region. Now, just briefly about the consequences of all these adventures. What we have in Egypt today, someone told me recently, an Egyptian journalist, he said we have two Egypts. The Egypt of 10%, those who live in villas and have swimming pools, and the 90%, the other Egypt of 90% who live in poverty and squalor. I thought that was a very telling and graphic depiction of what is happening there in that country, where you have 500,000 students graduating every year. 500,000 every year. And they can't find jobs. So you have this growing frustration and this anger, building up. And so how does he address it? He builds 30 new prisons. Since 2013, they built 13 new prisons. To do what? To imprison the young people who cannot find jobs. So it is easier to end up in a prison cell than it is to find a job. And the young people are saying, well, if it was just a matter of going to the prison, they don't mind. But the torture, the medical neglect, the inhumanity of what takes place inside the prisons, that is what, is something that they cannot deal with. And so we have a situation now where there is 40% unemployment. However, we can see the signs of meltdown in Egypt today, that the apparatus that was set up in 2013, it is beginning to crack. Not in the case of Hanan and Shafiq only, but we can see what is happening with the media. The various satellite stations that they had set up and supported after 2013, a lot of these TV stations are now closing down, laying off workers. And it is not just because of the economic crunch. They're closing them because they're no longer having an effect on public opinion. People are seeing through the lies. They know that what is being put out by these TV stations lacks any sense of truth and reason and logic. And so they turn in their backs on these TV stations. And so they realize, well, there's no point spending money on them. So they close them down. I think in the end, what I should say is that the very conditions that existed in 2011 that overthrew Mubarak, those conditions have returned. repression, poverty, corruption, abuse of power. And if those were the conditions that drove the young people to rise up in 2011, I think they will sooner or later drive them to rise up against the Sisi regime. Thank you. Sorry.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the organisers for organising such an important event. I'd like to talk today about the relationship between the UK and Egypt, which I think is defined by a number of factors. So the refugee crisis, the crisis in Libya, and counter-terrorism. But in particular, I want to focus on trade between the UK government and Egypt, because I really believe that given the human rights crisis that's taking place in Egypt at the moment, that this really speaks volumes about the lack of integrity of certain members of the British government, that we're really pushing for trade, pushing for profit with Egypt, with very little return for the Egyptian people themselves. So Britain and Egypt's trade relationship goes back a long way. Britain occupied Egypt in 1882 at a time when really their cotton trade was really thriving. Egyptian cotton is considered the best in the world, but instead of allowing Egyptians to set up their own factories to process cotton, much like the rest of the colonial world, they just saw Egypt as a source of raw material and shipped all the cotton out to suit their own industries, to suit their own empire. So, and it's really this legacy of dependency that the British left behind in Egypt. So Egypt is still very dependent on importing food, on importing wheat. They're still very dependent on foreign sources of revenue, so from the Gulf, for example. And all these decades later, and Britain are still pushing for trade in the country, and it's not cotton anymore, it's companies like BP, Vodafone, and in February this year, the biggest trade delegation in decades arrived in Cairo. Now, one of the key years that was very instrumental in this push for trade was 2015. It's the year the British government appointed Sir Geoffrey Donaldson as trade envoy to Egypt, and it's the year that our then Prime Minister David Cameron rolled out the red carpet for Sisi, even though numerous human rights organisations had constantly raised the issue of the violations he was continuing at home. For Sisi himself, the 2 years of debt and the 2011 revolution really took their toll on the economy. He was desperate for foreign investment. That year, he held a huge conference in Sharm el-Sheikh for something like 2,000 delegates. And one of the biggest projects to come out of this was a second capital city, bankrolled by the UAE. Something like 2 weeks after that, he sailed down the Suez Canal on a naval flotilla to launch the inauguration of the deepening and the widening of the Suez Canal, which was supposed to raise annual revenue. But in fact, neither of these projects have come to anything. Nothing has happened with the capital city, and revenue from the Suez Canal has actually declined. So all of this has unfolded against a furious pursuit of opposition activists in Egypt, where even a Facebook post criticising the president could land you in a rat-infested jail. There's something like 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt at the moment, which means that Sisi's rule far outweighs Mubarak's in terms of violations, because people put the number of political prisoners in 2011 at between 5,000 and 10,000. And I think it's really important to remember that during Sisi's rule, he's actually overseen 3 mass killings. So on the 8th of July 2013, 61 protesters were killed outside the Republican Guard headquarters. A month later, 37 prisoners were gassed inside a police van outside a prison in the summer heat. And, of course, the rubber massacre, which no one ever talks about, in which over 1,000 Egyptians were slaughtered in the street for protesting against the removal of the democratically elected government. So I really think it's the response of the British government to the rubber massacre which really laid the groundwork or laid bare how Britain wanted their relationship with Egypt to go. So Foreign Minister at the time, William Hague, said he was deeply concerned. So 1,000 people are massacred in the streets. The whole square where they're protesting is blocked off, so ambulances can't get in, can't get out. Security services go to each of the pharmacies nearby and say, do not give any medicine to these people. And our foreign minister says he's deeply concerned. So I think it's quite clear that what William Hague was actually deeply concerned about was his trade deals, was British multinationals and the profits he was making from Egypt. And if he was to come out and really make a stand on this, what would happen to those trade deals? But to be honest, it's not just weak statements made by members of the British establishment that's the problem. It's the fact that since the 2013 massacre, since the 2013 coup, Britain has increased trade with Egypt and has been actively pushing for more and more. So, for example, in the 4 years after the 2013 coup, Britain licensed £123 million worth of arms to Egypt, whereas in the 4 years before the coup, they licensed £76 million worth. In 2015, exports hit a record high, and one of the most instrumental members of the British establishment in pushing this has been the British Egyptian ambassador, who said he's hungry for more investment. Former Middle East Minister Tobias Ellwood visited Egypt in 2015 and was surrounded by a huge trade delegation. And when he was returned, he was asked, did you raise the issue of human rights? And he said he couldn't remember. So this is a former British minister visiting a country which is the third world's jailer of journalists worldwide, and he says he can't remember whether he raised the issue of human rights. 2 weeks after the Italian student Giulio Regeni was found dumped on a highway in Egypt, Jeffrey Donaldson, the trade envoy to Egypt, made an announcement and said Egypt is a land of opportunity for British companies. Now, Giulio Regeni was Italian, yes, but he was studying in the UK. He was a British student. He went to Leeds and then he went to Cambridge. So the British government did nothing to stand up for him, did not speak out about human rights. Instead, they were forced to make another limp statement after his friends and family forced them to do so through a petition. In 2016, British foreign investment in Egypt hit $30 billion, which means that Britain are not using their leverage to force Egypt to behave. They, in fact, have given Egypt that year, given President Sisi $50,000 for every single political prisoner that is locked up in his dungeons. It's not difficult to see why Britain are pushing for these trade deals. In particular, the one that springs to mind is the 2015 BP deal, in which BP has managed to haggle a product sharing agreement for 2 offshore blocks found off the coast of Egypt, where they will keep 100% of profits from the production yield coming from these 2 offshore blocks. Now, traditionally in Egypt, a foreign investor's share in a production sharing agreement like this would be between 20 and 30%. And BP have haggled a 100% deal. And this is being taxed. This is all revenue going to the British government. So a former advisor of Morsi estimated that this particular BP deal cost the Egyptian people something like $32 billion. And this is really what's at the heart of the problem with British investment in Egypt, is how much of it is going to fund schools, to fund roads, to fund education projects, and how much is going into the pockets of a wealthy elite close to the president. Multinationals themselves say this money will trickle down, that it will benefit Egyptians in form of jobs, etc., but there's absolutely no evidence of this. In fact, Egyptians are actually getting poorer. In 2013, 26.3% of Egyptians lived below the poverty line. In 2015, this figure went up to 27.8%, and it was predicted that in 2017, this figure would be at least 35%. Every Egyptian who you speak to complains about the rise in milk, bread, rice, basic commodities in Egypt. And to be honest, corruption is getting worse in Egypt. In 2015, the country scored 88 out of 168 on the corruption index. And in 2016, they slipped even further down, landing at number 108. The former head of Egypt's anti-corruption watchdog reckoned that between 2012 and 2015, Egyptian officials had squandered $67.6 billion. So you have a situation in Egypt where poverty is going up, corruption is going up, human rights violations are going up, but then British investment in the country is going up. So it's not difficult to draw the conclusion that instead of using their leverage, and they have a lot of leverage to use, in forcing Egypt to behave, in forcing them to, raise the human rights violations in the country, instead, the turmoil and the repression in Egypt is creating favourable conditions for British multinationals and for economic return and for profit. Thank you. They're just a few brief points, and I hope we can expand more on it on the Q&A.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon, everyone. On my way down on the train today, I was thinking that whenever I come and speak at an event, I normally say something along the lines of, it's a real pleasure to come and attend. But the word pleasure just seems wrong when you're talking about an event like today. That is an extract from President Barack Obama's speech on the 11th of February of 2011, the day that President Mubarak stood down. 7 years on, instead of celebrating the successes of the revolution, we're talking about enforced disappearances, torture, rape, and sexual violence. But I'm not here to talk to you about the extent of the tragedy that exists in Egypt. What I wanted to talk to you about, what I've been asked to talk to you about, are whether in fact there are legal solutions within the UK legal system that can help facilitate change in Egypt. And the scope of what I'm going to talk about, because it's obviously an extremely large topic, I need 15 days, not 15 minutes. But what I'll try and do is cover just a couple of general principles, establish with you what crimes against humanity actually means, the role of the International Criminal Court, UK statutory powers relating to crimes against humanity and war crimes, alternative non-legal measures. So if the law can't facilitate change, what can? And then if we have time, Home Office powers relating to prohibiting people whose presence in the UK would be not conducive to the public good. So, general principle, because this is something that I'm asked about quite a bit. These are not pictures of Egyptian security forces. These are Spanish security forces in Catalonia last year, where they tried to prevent Catalonian voters from carrying out the independence referendum that they were seeking the end of 2017. More than 460 people were injured by these Spanish security forces. Riot police went into ballot stations and took ballot boxes. something that's completely unheard of in the Western world, something familiar to us as Egyptians. We hear about that kind of thing a lot, but not in a country like Spain that's a signatory to the European Court of Justice, that's a member of the European Union. None of the European nations were able to interfere in Spanish domestic affairs, but what some nations did was express condemnation, but that's as far as it went. And the reason for that is that every nation is sovereign. Sovereignty means that every nation has the right to self-governance. There are exceptions to that, where the international community and individual nation states have a positive duty to intervene. And that's in relation to crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. That's a picture from the Nuremberg trials after World War II. So, there is no international treaty that defines crimes against humanity. But the Rome Statute is the legal instrument that set up the International Criminal Court. And Article 7 of the statute defines crimes against humanity. So we've got murder, extermination, deportation, torture, rape, sexual slavery, enforced disappearance of persons. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So when we look at Egypt and whether in fact that test or that definition of crimes against humanity has been met, we know, don't we, from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, and from the United Nations, that that definition has been met consistently since 2013. The United Nations Committee on Torture published its findings in the latter part of 2017. And in their mind, in order for torture to be considered systemic, it needs to be widespread, it needs to be habitual, and it needs to be deliberate. And in the findings of the United Nations, all three of those criteria were met when it came to the Egyptian forces and their use of torture across the country. So, if that definition has been met, and if that's part of the remit of the International Criminal Court, can the International Criminal Court intervene in relation to Egypt and bring prosecutions? The short answer, unfortunately, is no, because one of the limits of the International Criminal Court is that member states have to have accepted the jurisdiction of the court. Egypt, surprise, surprise, isn't a member of the International Criminal Court, as indeed Syria and Iraq. So just as an example, in the next slide, there's a picture of one of the ICC prosecutors, and she was tasked with investigating whether there was any remit for the ICC to bring prosecutions in relation to Syria and Iraq for the actions of ISIS. Unfortunately, the answer was no, because neither Iraq or Syria were members of the ICC. And although there were members of member states such as the UK who had been fighting there, it was considered that the jurisdictional basis was too narrow. So, if the ICC doesn't have a role to play, then who does? And where does the UK legal system fit in? Well, under international conventions such as the Geneva Convention and other conventions in respect of the prohibition against torture, the United Kingdom has a positive duty to codify in its own domestic legislation legislation to prosecute and penalise people who have breached those international treaties. So those laws have existed for some time. There isn't really the scope in today's presentation to go through them in any massive detail, but they've been around since after World War II and have resulted in prosecutions against members of the former Nazi regime. And with that, and this is something that some people may have heard of reported in the media over the years, is the possibility of UK magistrates issuing arrest warrants for private prosecutions in order for perpetrators of war crimes to be prosecuted on UK soil. even though the crimes weren't committed by British citizens and weren't committed on British soil. The first, one of the first controversial uses of that power we'll talk about a little bit later. But this is the idea of universal jurisdiction, and every single nation state has a positive duty to ensure that is complied with. Now, before 2012, private individuals could apply for arrest warrants without the consent of the Director of Public Prosecutions. There was quite a controversial case where pro-Palestinian supporters managed to get an arrest warrant when they heard news that the former Israeli Foreign Minister, Ms. Livni, was due to visit the UK in 2009. Now, when that happened, they went to the Magistrates' Court. The Magistrates' Court managed to issue an arrest warrant. And there are various criteria that the Magistrates' Court look at. So whether, in fact, they have the right to issue the warrant, whether, in fact, the individual is likely to be within the UK jurisdiction, and whether the allegations that are brought by the person seeking the arrest warrant are in any way vexatious. So if it's all made up, it's just an attempt to abuse the person who may or may not be arrested. The arrest warrant was obtained successfully. The Israeli government obviously heard about it. Ms. Livni heard about it, and she cancelled her trip to the UK. Now, all of this happened when the UK government didn't actually know that the arrest warrant was issued in the first place. And for obvious foreign relations reasons, the UK government didn't see that as a particularly satisfactory state of affairs. And the laws changed. There were specific exemptions in respect of Israeli diplomats. But generally, anyone who wants to bring an application for an arrest warrant now has to get the permission of the Director of Public Prosecutions. You can imagine groups like Liberty and Justice, which are UK-based human rights organisations, were very much against that proposal because it took away fundamental rights and meant that foreign policy issues were more likely to impact decisions in respect of arrest warrants and prosecutions. But in 2014, the British police it confirmed, and the CPS, which is the Crown Prosecution Service, accepted that state immunity for diplomats didn't prevent the police from carrying out investigations into the Egyptian regime and its military leaders in respect of the massacre that happened in August of 2013 in Rabat. This was an extremely positive move for the purpose of the recognition of the human rights atrocities and the fact that the UK government, or at least the UK police, were very much keen to investigate it. And whilst there was initial opposition because there was suggestion that these people are immune, they're diplomats, and therefore cannot be subject to investigation, it was held that they were able to be investigated. The question of prosecution, of course, is an entirely separate matter. Then in 2015, we had the infamous and controversial visit of President al-Sisi. If you get that, no British judge can interfere with it. That's a decision that's made by the Foreign Office. But what was argued, and there was a big judicial review claim that was supported by Lord MacDonald, that shouldn't be used as a loophole for people like members of the Egyptian regime or members of the Israeli government that have been involved in genocide in Gaza to come to the UK and avoid prosecution or avoid investigation. Unfortunately, the High Court found that this is a convention in international law. The protection of diplomats and government members is a protection in international law. If the state receiving the person accepts that they are a part of a special mission, then that has to be respected. Otherwise, it would be a breach of international law. And so he came at the invitation of the Ministry of Justice, or the Ministry of Defence, I think it was. So we find ourselves in a situation where, in theory, the law is there to protect and to investigate and to prosecute. The impetus from the police here is there. But because of these loopholes, which are entangled with political concerns and foreign relations, whether in fact it's actually going to result in effective prosecutions remains to be seen. So some alternatives, if we could maybe just jump through a couple of the slides. And the next one. Okay, so if the law can't help us to exact change in Egypt, what can? Just a few examples from recent times. It wouldn't have escaped many in the room that Sir Crispin Blunt, who actually was opposed to David Cameron's invitation to President al-Sisi a couple of years ago anyway, but he has compiled a team of MPs and lawyers and a GP and has asked to have access to President Morsi in prison in Egypt. And that invitation was instigated by a letter that was written to him by President Morsi's son, confirming or setting out his medical difficulties and the concerns that the family had about him. And so Crispin Blunt made a public request to the Egyptian embassy in order to have a visa, in order to have access to him in Tora prison. As far as I'm aware, as yet, the Egyptian authorities haven't responded to that request. But it's quite a significant and positive move because, again, it shows that there is a willingness from the UK to try and cast a light on the human rights atrocities that are happening in Egypt. Diplomacy has shown over the past few years to have changed situations or affected change in respect of particular people. So you've got a picture of Aya Hegezi there with President Trump. And after she and her husband had spent 2 years in prison in Egypt because of the activities that they carried out. And they weren't political. They were just carrying out charitable projects, trying to clean up the streets, trying to set up projects that will help change the lives for people on the streets in Egypt. She was arrested along with her husband. They remained in detention for 2 years. And it wasn't until President al-Sisi visited Washington and following that we heard news that she was freed and that she and her husband were acquitted of all charges. And the reason why I bring that up is that through campaigning, through protesting, through raising awareness of individual cases, it may well be the only way for nations that have significant leverage in Egypt and in the region to be able to exact change for individuals. Amal Clooney, who's a UK-based barrister, has tried on a number of occasions to bring about change in Egypt and again to express public condemnation of the Egyptian legal system. And the International Bar Association published a report on the Egyptian judicial system and its failings in 2014. Emma Clooney went to Cairo in order to publish the report, and she was threatened with arrest because the report was obviously damning of the Egyptian government and the judiciary. The final thing that's worth mentioning is the Home Office powers to prevent entry of individuals under certain conditions. The immigration rules that apply to visitors and applies to everyone coming from overseas is that if somebody has engaged in activities, and it doesn't have to be criminal convictions, it could be just simply hate speech or other public statements, and intends to come to the UK, the Home Office has a discretion to refuse entry to the UK for those people if their presence will not be conducive to the public good. And in the past week, that power has been exercised in respect of 3 individuals, 2 American citizens that are associates of Tony Robinson. Tony Robinson is the controversial former leader of the English Defence League, has a few choice opinions on Islam and Muslims. Because of the husband was going to be giving a hate speech in Hyde Park in London, and she was going to be meeting and interviewing Tony Robinson, and it was considered that their presence was not conducive to the public good. They arrived in Luton Airport, they were detained, kept in detention for 2 days, and then they were sent back. And there was a Canadian journalist who was also denied entry for the same reasons. Now, the Home Office have an email address and a team that are dedicated to dealing with these types of applications. And it invites submissions from the public if the public are aware, or groups are aware, that somebody is coming to the UK and wishes to make representations about that person. Now, the obvious example are Egyptian news presenters and journalists who have been inciting acts of terror and acts of torture against members of the Muslim Brotherhood or anyone who is perceived to be a supporter of them or anyone who speaks against the regime. Everybody in the room probably knows the obvious examples of those journalists and news presenters and TV presenters that have said some pretty horrendous things on Egyptian media. And it remains to be seen whether, in fact, any of them are intending to come to the UK, and if they are, whether groups can campaign to try and put pressure on the Secretary of State for the Home Office to exercise that discretion and prevent them from entering the UK. And it isn't easy because it's a balance between the right to free speech, the right to free press, and whether, in fact, their presence will in fact result in disharmony and the risk of public disorder. But I would say that it is well worth preparing yourselves, and if anybody does have material that they want to submit, that they should do it. And if you have perhaps work collectively and get some signatures and express solid opinions as to why you think their presence here in the UK would be against the public good, then we may well be able to stop these people from coming in. And it might not have an immediate impact on what happens in Egypt, but it's symbolic, isn't it? And it shows that the UK government is willing to take steps, albeit indirectly, to express some kind of condemnation. I've pretty much come up to the end of my time. Thank you very much for listening. I will be around for questions, and hopefully during the Q&A we can explore some of the issues in more detail.
So a massive thank you to all our speakers. We're now opening the floor to Q&A. You can direct your question to a certain speaker. We'll try our best to balance that out. Also, if you feel more comfortable asking your question in Arabic, we can do our best to translate as well. So we're now opening the floor to Q&A.
My question is to Dr. Daud Abdullah. Thanks so much for the talk. You have already mentioned and talked about Sinai and the deal of the century. Some people actually dispute this kind of deal, and they sometimes even accuse people of this is kind of allegation which is unrealistic to happen. So I would like to hear your opinion, please.
The question is, there is some little controversy surrounding the deal of the century, whether it exists or not. I think that's the essence of it. It is true that the American administration has not announced it or submitted it formally to the Palestinians in particular. But there is no doubt that President Trump has been on the record as saying that his presidency will bring an end to the conflict in Palestine and peace to the region. And the term, the phrase, deal of the century, he actually used it. Now, the Palestinians themselves, they also confirm that they haven't received anything from him. But the diplomacy that has been taking place, after he announced, in particular, the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem, it gave a sense of belief that there is something being orchestrated by the Americans. First of all, his first foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia. And he called all of, 57 leaders from the Muslim world and the Arab world included to that summit in Riyadh. Now, when he announced that he was going to transfer the embassy to Jerusalem, and there was a summit called in Istanbul, none of the Arab countries, went, the major countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, they sent very low-level delegations to Istanbul, and that was an indicator that, that the Saudis were not prepared to resist the American, initiatives. I think that there is an element of truth in the whole thing. First of all, the transfer of the embassy, there is no doubt about it. The reactions of the Saudis to it is clear. It's very lukewarm. There is no opposition to it, as well as from the Emiratis and the Egyptians. They've given some lip service and say Jerusalem is a red line. But we know that is not the case. And in recent days, the pressure is mounting on Mahmoud Abbas. The Saudis apparently have offered him some large sums of money, if he were to accept. And this is coming from PLO sources, that the Saudis are actually trying to buy Abbas or lure him into acceptance of, the American proposal. Whether we call it the deal of the century or not, the Americans have something in mind, and what it entails essentially is a compromise on Jerusalem, and perhaps most disturbingly, a compromise on the Sinai. Sorry.
Yeah, my name is Mohammed Sudan. My question is for Amelia. You talk about this kind of agreement, trade agreement between the Egyptian authority and UK, and how far is the Egyptians lose money, lose their resources from this kind of corruptive agreement as well. I need you to shed light about how far is the another countries plus UK. For instance, there is an agreement of trade between Italy, which is called any company Triple Gas, and they did just recently an agreement with the Egyptian authority for a well of gas well in the north coast of Egypt. And the deal was 30% for Egypt and 70% for Italy. And the common trades like this, it's just a 50 and a 50. Is that, any other agreements or trade agreements between the Egyptian authority recently after the coup and other countries, and why the Egyptian never talk about this? Why the Egyptian parliament never talk about this? We lose our resources, we lose our money, and our people are living under the poverty lines, and they need their money, they need their resources. Thank you.
I think definitely under Morsi that was one thing, because his advisor, Hatem Azam, was the one who said, look, this BP deal is costing us $32 billion. So he was really, really pushing to get a better deal with BP. With the Italian deal, Eni, they found the largest offshore natural gas off the coast of Egypt, and that happened to coincide with Giulio Regini's death. I can't remember which one happened before, but that's been largely cited as one of the reasons why the Italian ambassador was eventually
think it's like a bribe?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, Egypt are so desperate for foreign investment because of the 2011 revolution, because of years of debt where no natural gas company would give anything to Egypt because they were just building up more and more and more debt. So they're desperate for foreign investment now. And these companies are desperate to invest in Egypt because they're giving them such ridiculous deals because they're desperate. And yeah, I just find it very sad that none of this money is really going to Egyptian people who are the people that really need this money. I think, so in the end of the 2016 tax deal, Vodafone, who are the company that turned off the internet during the 2011 revolution, we should remember, paid like $166.4 million to the Egyptian government. BP paid $84.6 million, and just where is this money going? It's a large amount of money. Kind of very sad.
Question?
I'm from Birmingham. Thanks for all the speakers. A question for the second and third speakers. Do you think in the Egyptian case that the British political and economical sort of interests did override the British values of democracy and respect for human rights?
In my view, the short answer is yes, absolutely. David Cameron went and visited Cairo shortly after the revolution, and he was filmed going through the crowds in Tahrir Square and even speaking to a young child and asking him, "Are you now happy?" And he shook his hand and indicated, very much in the same way as President Obama did, that the revolution and the outcome of the revolution will be respected and supported by the UK, and that the Western world generally was relieved and supportive of the fact that Egypt had finally found democracy. But at the first opportunity that the UK had to bring President al-Sisi here and to invite leaders of the military here to carry out arms deals, they took it. Now, there's no walking on eggshells here. You call it as you call it. That must be, on the UK government's part, a compromise of fundamental human rights and international obligations. But it's not just the case with Egypt, is it? We see examples of this with many other nations. But yes, my answer is 100% yes.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. The current government in Britain are just pushing and pushing and pushing for profit in Egypt, and they could not care less about human rights violations in Egypt. I mean, it's so ridiculous that Sisi, he's overseen 3 mass killings, a massacre, 1,000 people were slaughtered in the street, and Britain are still pushing for trade agreements. I mean, it's just completely outrageous, and as I said in my talk, it just speaks of a complete lack of integrity of certain members of our government who are very good about talking about British rights or democracy for British citizens, but not quite so good when it's happening abroad to other people.
Regarding the situation in, when you talked about the chance of using the influence of countries who got leverage on Egypt, I just would like to attract your attention that in case of Aya Hijazi, she is an American national.
Yeah.
So I wonder if this element will be a reality in the situation of Egyptian citizens who are treated the same like Aya or even worse. And is there any chance from Donald Trump or the like to do anything to save such victims from the hands of Sisi?
Well, That was the dilemma, wasn't it, when Emil Clooney was representing Mr. Grast, the Canadian journalist. Now, he had the opportunity of possibly being pardoned and being deported from Egypt in order to just simply leave because he was a dual national. And one of his primary concerns was that would mean that he would leave his Egyptian colleague behind in prison. So obviously the leverage of somebody like Donald Trump or Theresa May or any other Western leaders may well just be limited to people who are dual nationals. But the leverage perhaps could extend beyond that, because if they use their leverage, there's nothing to stop them from citing examples of other people who are solely Egyptian nationals, who aren't dual citizens, and say that this cannot continue to happen. This is a breach of international conventions, if they wanted to do it. But that's where campaigning comes in, isn't it? The campaign.
Mind you that Ibrahim Hamel was an Irish.
Yeah.
It made him 4 good years.
Yeah.
Before the Irish government can do anything.
Yeah.
It won't probably be the same if he was, may I use the word, pure Irish.
Yes. Yeah, I accept that entirely. There are limitations.
So we should probably not put too much hope on this, or try to explore if there is on our part something to balance this, where to find a way to address those who got the power to be sincere and less hypocritic when they deal with such a situation.
Yes, absolutely. I accept that 100%.
You said previously that the British government dealing with us according to their interests, like the economic relation between Britain and Egypt. My question, is this related to Conservative Party policies, or it is just British attitude towards our country regardless of who's in 10 Downing Street?
I suppose the difficulty there is that we haven't seen any other party other than the Conservatives or the coalition government dealing with it. But obviously at the time that David Cameron was inviting President al-Sisi, Jeremy Corbyn spoke out about it in very strong terms. I imagine that somebody like Jeremy Corbyn, if he has the opportunity to lead this country, may well take a different stance. But then we said that, or we thought that about President Obama before he went into the White House. It's very easy when you're in opposition to make promises. It's quite another when you're there and you have pressures internally from your own cabinet and externally. The UK doesn't make its own decisions based on what the UK government considers to be in their own interest. There are influences, as we know, externally. So it's a very difficult question to answer.
Thank you.
One question to Amelia and one question to Mona. The role of ambassadors in human rights reporting. A couple of years ago, we met the British ambassador here in London very briefly. We talked with him and he told us that he is not allowed, he is implementing the British government policy not to contacting the opposition in Egypt. And we are the opposition of the current regime. Our ambassador in Egypt is very fluent in slang Egyptian language. He talks, he likes to be pictured while he's eating pisir. Pisir is a rotten fish, but he likes to eat it and have a picture of it so that he says that he is feeling the Egyptian food, so to speak. He also talks about sahlab, and sahlab is a drink like tea and so on in Egypt. He likes to play football with the children, etc., etc. But his rule he has no obligation to report on human rights in Egypt, particularly when we contacted the Foreign Office here or the Prime Minister office in London here. When they answer us, they never mention the issue of human rights as it's being known in the media or in reality. So if this a policy of the British government or the ambassadors not to report human rights abuses?
Well, I think John Casson had, like, every time that there's an attack on a Coptic church, he, quite rightly comes out and condemns it. There are certain human rights issues which he has a problem with, but if he thinks it's something that's going to stand in the way of Egyptian UK trade, then he doesn't come out. And so, for example, after Giulio Regini died, 5 British MPs were visiting the UK, and he tweeted, because as you said, he's very active on Twitter, and tweeted, what are your priorities when for, things that these UK MPs should raise when they come to Egypt, and not one of the options were human rights. So, and I believe it's up to every single person who's part of this establishment to act with integrity if there are 60,000 political prisoners being tortured in jail.
Your second question?
Anyway, I'm talking about how we can make him accountable.
What, John Casson?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, how do we make... I agree with you. How do you make the whole of the British government, who don't seem to care at all about Egyptian people, accountable? I think protests, talking about it in the media, talking about, I don't know, just raising issues like, should our government really be making profit from a country that has such severe human rights abuses? Raising awareness and talking about it in the media. I mean, Egypt isn't, how to make British people care more about Egypt in the same way that they care about Palestine or that they care about Syria, for example.
My question to Mona is Magnitsky Global Act is an American law. 2 days ago, we heard our Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition talking about the implementation of Magnitsky Global Law on the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
Does this mean that we have the equivalent of Magnitsky Global Law here so that we can get use of it?
If the point of the question is what laws here exist in order to bring about condemnation and prosecution of members of the Egyptian regime, is that what you mean? Well, that's sort of what I covered in the presentation. So there are international treaties which have been codified into British law, which means that things like prosecutions, investigations, arrest warrants, all fear about. If I could just add something to your first question about what we can do to try and exert pressure on members of the UK government. One of the very, very positive things about the BBC documentary was that it brought Egypt back into mainstream media, because mainstream media hasn't really been reporting on Egypt in that particular way for quite some time. And when I was sort of doing some internet research in preparation for my talk today, I came across a freedom of information request that was written by an individual having watched the documentary, and the writer had very specific questions about what action the UK government has taken or will be taken, what they promise to do in light of the revelation of these human rights violations. Anybody can make a freedom of information request, and in fact it can be framed to deal with your particular issue about the UK ambassador and why it is there is a government policy that prevents UK government officials from speaking to opposition parties in other nations, whether that is specific to Egypt, if not, why not, or if it is, why it is, and what the UK government intends to do in order to ensure that adequate reporting of human rights violations happens in Egypt and is brought to the attention of the British public. That's something that perhaps that can be done on behalf of the Freedom and Justice Party here in London, or in fact it can just be done by anyone sitting in this room.
Any more questions? Okay, that's fine. We'll wrap up this first session, so I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our guests today for their time and for their knowledge. There'll be a coffee break for half an hour. There'll be tea and refreshments provided, so if you go out this door and straight to your left, you'll be guided to where the coffee will be provided, and then we'll start back at 4:30, so please be back for 4:30 or session number 2, please, and thank you.